You reach the thing you wanted, the promotion, the house, the relationship you circled for years, and within days the satisfaction thins out into something that feels almost like nothing. That hollow after achievement has two ancient diagnoses, and they contradict each other. Aristotle said you felt empty because you were chasing a feeling instead of building a life. Epicurus said you felt empty because you never learned what pleasure actually was. Both men lived in Athens within a single generation of each other, and both spent their lives answering one question: what is joy, and why does it keep slipping away? In this video we will set their two systems side by side, Eudaimonia against Epicurean pleasure, and find what each of them got right. Before we go further, if this kind of philosophy interests you, subscribe. We publish new videos every week on ideas that actually change how you think. Here is the strange part. Around 306 BC, Epicurus bought a garden on the edge of Athens and taught a doctrine of pleasure so austere that most days he ate bread and water. Aristotle, decades earlier, wrote an entire ethics that barely mentions pleasure as a goal at all. Two thinkers of joy, and neither one trusted the thing you're probably chasing. Start with Aristotle, because his claim is the one modern life quietly ignores. In the Nicomachean Ethics, around 340 BC, he argues that the highest human good is eudaimonia, a word we translate as happiness but which means something closer to a life well lived, a flourishing that spans the whole arc of a person. What matters is his definition: eudaimonia is activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Notice that it's an activity, not a sensation, which means it's something you enact rather than something you receive. This distinction changes everything downstream. If joy were a feeling, you could get it from a drug, a compliment, a lucky afternoon. But Aristotle says feelings come and go while character does not, and a life is judged by its pattern, not its peaks. This is why he writes, in Book 1, that one swallow does not make a summer, nor does one fine day. A single good moment tells you nothing about whether a life is going well. Picture the executive who has spent 15 years accumulating the outward marks of success. On paper the life is flourishing. Inside, there's a persistent flatness he can't name, and he assumes the answer is a bigger achievement. Aristotle would tell him he's measuring the wrong thing entirely, he's been counting good days instead of asking whether he's been living well. And yet if eudaimonia isn't a feeling, we're left with a harder problem, because pleasure clearly does matter, and there was a man across town who staked his entire philosophy on it. Epicurus took the opposite starting point. Writing in his Athenian garden around 300 BC, he declared plainly, in the letter to Menicius, that pleasure is the beginning and end of the blessed life. Where Aristotle built his ethics on virtue and activity, Epicurus built his on sensation. He trusted the body's testimony that pain is bad and pleasure is good, and he refused to complicate what nature had made obvious. This sounds like hedonism, and for 2,000 years the word Epicurean has meant exactly that: rich food, fine wine, endless indulgence. But that reading collapses the moment you read what he actually ate. He described a meal of bread and water as a feast fit for the gods, and he wrote that plain flavors give the same pleasure as expensive ones once the pain of hunger is removed. His pleasure was not accumulation. It was relief. Consider the person who orders more, buys more, schedules more, convinced that the next acquisition will finally deliver the feeling. Epicurus watched Athenians do the same thing and diagnosed it precisely: they were mistaking the removal of a small discomfort for a great pleasure, then manufacturing new discomforts to remove. Honestly, this is the part of Epicurus I find most modern. He understood the treadmill 23 centuries before anyone gave it a name. But to see what he really meant, we have to correct the misunderstanding that has followed his name around ever since. Here is the debunk the whole topic turns on. When Epicurus said the goal was pleasure, he did not mean the pleasures of motion, the rush of eating, drinking, acquiring. He meant what the Greeks called katastematic pleasure, the pleasure of a settled state, ataraxia, freedom from mental disturbance, and aponia, freedom from bodily pain. Joy, for him, was not a peak you climb toward. It was the quiet that remains when nothing is missing and nothing is threatening. This reframes his austerity entirely. He wasn't denying himself out of guilt or discipline for its own sake, he was subtracting everything that generated anxiety, and he'd noticed that luxury generates a great deal of it. The more elaborate your appetites, the more can go wrong, and the more your peace depends on things outside your control. So he distinguished natural and necessary desires, like food and shelter, from empty desires, like fame and unlimited wealth, and taught that the second kind can never be satisfied because they have no natural limit. I'll admit I once read Epicurus as the philosopher of the good dinner party. I was wrong. He's closer to a physician of the mind who happened to conclude that most of our suffering is self-inflicted, generated by fears and cravings we were never obligated to hold. Which brings us to something surprising, because for two men usually treated as opposites, Aristotle and Epicurus were quietly circling the same target. On the surface they're enemies. One makes virtue the core of the good life, the other makes pleasure. Yet look at what each of them actually rejects, and the rivalry softens. Both men agree that the crowd is chasing the wrong thing, that wealth, reputation, and endless consumption are false roads to joy. Aristotle dismisses the life of money-making as merely useful, not good in itself. Epicurus calls the desire for it empty. They arrive at the same warning from opposite directions. They also agree that joy is not passive. Aristotle's Eudaimonia is an activity you perform, Epicurus's ataraxia is a state you actively cultivate through reasoning about your desires, correcting false beliefs, and choosing friendship over ambition. Neither man thinks joy simply happens to you. Both think it's the result of a trained mind making better judgments over time, which means both make you responsible for it. There's even a shared verdict on friendship. Aristotle devotes 2 whole books of the Ethics to it, calling the friendship of virtue the highest form. Epicurus, for all his talk of self-sufficiency, wrote that of all the things wisdom provides for a happy life, the greatest by far is friendship. 2 rival schools, and they land in the same place. What they disagree about, in the end, isn't whether joy takes work, it's what joy is made of. And that disagreement matters most on the days when everything goes wrong. Test both systems against loss, because that's where a philosophy of joy either holds or shatters. Suppose the project fails, the illness comes, the plan you built your identity on falls apart. What does each man leave you with? Epicurus offers a strange kind of shelter, since joy is the absence of disturbance, and since most disturbance comes from cravings and fears we can examine and release, he'd have you reduce your dependence on external outcomes until very little can shake you. Remove the fear of death, remove empty desires, and what remains is hard to take from you. Aristotle is more honest about how much can be lost, and I think that honesty is his real strength. He admits, in Book 1, that a flourishing life can be damaged by great misfortune. He refuses to pretend the virtuous man feels nothing when tragedy strikes. But he insists the good person bears misfortune with a certain nobility, and that virtue, once built, is the most stable thing a human can own because it belongs to your character rather than your circumstances. Your house can burn. Your courage cannot be repossessed. So here's where they leave the person standing in the wreckage of a bad year. Epicurus says, you were carrying more than you needed, put it down, and peace returns. Aristotle says, what you built into your character is still yours, act from it, and the life is still good. One offers relief through subtraction. The other offers stability through what you've become. And the most useful move, it turns out, is not to choose between them. The thesis this whole comparison defends is simple. Joy is neither the feeling Epicurus refined nor the activity Aristotle demanded, but the meeting of both, a life built on worthy action, carried by a mind that has subtracted its false wants. Here's the practice, in 3 steps. First, once a week, name one empty desire you're carrying, fame, comparison, an acquisition you don't need, and set it down, the way Epicurus emptied his appetites. Second, Name one thing you can do, not feel, that expresses the character you want to have, and do it that day, the way Aristotle measured a life by activity. Third, at day's end, ask which of the two you neglected, and correct it tomorrow. Subtract the noise, build the character. That is the joy that survives a bad day. Aristotle said virtue is not something you decide, it is something you build, one day at a time. Subscribe if you want to keep building. And if you want a daily structure for that, I put together a Stoic daily journal. 365 exercises, one per day, built on exactly the ideas we covered today. It is $14. Link in the description. All books mentioned today are linked there as well.